In April 1982, Argentina launched a surprise invasion of the Falkland Islands, or the Malvinas as they are known in Argentina. What appeared to be a small territorial conflict quickly spiraled into one of the most intense and dramatic military campaigns of the late 20th century. At first glance, these remote islands in the South Atlantic seemed insignificant on the world stage, but in reality, they became the center of a clash that mixed politics, pride, and sheer survival. For the Argentine junta, facing growing unrest and economic collapse at home, the gamble was bold: capture the islands and rally national support. Yet this decision would set off a chain of events that neither side could fully control. For Britain, the challenge was extraordinary. Thousands of miles away from home, with harsh weather, unforgiving seas, and limited resources, it seemed almost impossible to mount a successful counterattack. Yet Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher and her government saw retreat as unacceptable. To give up the Falklands, in their eyes, would mean rewarding aggression and undermining Britain's global standing. Thus began an extraordinary journey, a naval task force steaming across the Atlantic. Soldiers and Marines preparing for battle in some of the toughest conditions imaginable, and a nation bracing for one of its most dangerous military operations since World War II. The story that unfolds is not just about ships, aircraft, and artillery. It is about human endurance. Young Argentine conscripts, barely out of their teenage years, faced freezing nights, shortages of food, and the shock of confronting seasoned British paratroopers and commandos. On the other side, British soldiers endured exhausting marches through bogs and mountains, carrying loads that pushed their bodies to the brink. In this, the landscape itself, windswept ridges, icy rain, and treacherous terrain became as much an enemy as the opposing army. And yet, within these struggles, we find stories of courage, sacrifice, and determination. Elite units clashed under the cover of darkness. Desperate battles were fought for control of key hills, and ordinary men found themselves in extraordinary circumstances. From the tragedy of Bluff Cove, where dozens of British lives were lost in an air strike, to the final night battles around Port Stanley, the Falklands War revealed both the brutality and the humanity of modern conflict. This video will take you step by step through those events: the surprise invasion, the British response, the decisive night raids, and the final surrender. But more than that, it will uncover the lessons hidden in these battles, the costs of war, the resilience of the human spirit, and the way a distant struggle changed the fate of nations. If you are passionate about history, strategy, and the stories of people caught in extraordinary times, you are in the right place. Don't forget to like this video, share it with friends who enjoy history, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss our deep dives into the past. The Falklands conflict is not just a story of 1982, it is a reminder of how quickly the world can change, and how far nations will go when their honor and identity are on the line. Now, let us journey into the heart of the South Atlantic and relive the battle for the Falklands. When the news of Argentina's sudden invasion of the Falkland Islands reached London in early April 1982, the shock reverberated through the British government and across its people like a wave crashing against a rocky shore. Here was a challenge to sovereignty, a bold and calculated move by a distant South American nation that had chosen to strike at a territory more than 8,000 miles away from the British Isles. For Britain, this was not simply about a small cluster of windswept islands in the South Atlantic. It was about principle, identity, and global standing. Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher and her cabinet knew at once that inaction would send a message of weakness to both allies and rivals alike, undermining Britain's role on the world stage. Despite the daunting logistical challenges posed by the sheer distance, the decision was made swiftly and decisively. Britain would send a naval task force to retake the islands. embarking on what history would remember as the last great colonial war fought by the nation. The magnitude of this decision cannot be overstated. The Falkland Islands lay far beyond the normal reach of Britain's military power, and to project force there required immense planning, coordination, and resolve. The Royal Navy, which had seen its size and influence diminish in the post-war decades, suddenly found itself thrust into the spotlight. Ships were recalled from across the globe, hastily prepared and loaded with supplies, while aircraft carriers, destroyers, frigates, and transport ships were assembled into a formidable armada. This was not simply a routine deployment. It was a statement to the world that Britain would not abandon its people or its commitments, no matter how distant the battlefield. The sight of this fleet setting sail captured the imagination of the British public, who, in the midst of economic hardship at home, rallied behind the boldness of the mission. At the same time, the logistical difficulties of such an operation loomed large. Britain's naval planners faced the daunting task of sustaining a force thousands of miles from friendly ports, in some of the roughest seas on Earth, and against an enemy that held the advantage of proximity. The South Atlantic's unpredictable weather, with its violent gales and frigid waters, posed as much of a threat as the Argentine forces themselves. Every mile traveled was a reminder of just how far Britain was willing to go to uphold its position and defend what it considered rightfully its own. And yet, with each passing day at sea, the determination hardened. Transforming the fleet into more than just ships and sailors, it became a symbol of national defiance, of a people unwilling to bow to pressure or intimidation. For Argentina, the calculation had been that Britain, weakened by distance and distracted by domestic concerns, would be unable or unwilling to respond with force. The junta believed that seizing the islands would ignite patriotic fervor at home, overshadowing the country's worsening economy and repressive politics. In Buenos Aires, the initial celebrations of the invasion reflected a confidence that Britain would not dare to launch such a costly and distant campaign. But this underestimated the resolve of a nation that, despite recent decline, still carried within its veins the legacy of empire and the will to defend its interests across the globe. By dispatching the task force, Britain demonstrated that the Falklands were not a forgotten outpost, but a living part of its national identity, one that would not be surrendered without a fight. The British public, watching the events unfold through newspapers and television broadcasts, found themselves drawn into the drama of what was quickly becoming a defining moment of the Thatcher era. The departure of the fleet was broadcast live, with images of sailors waving goodbye to loved ones and aircraft carriers cutting through the waters, forging a powerful narrative of sacrifice and duty. Suddenly, the distant islands most Britons had scarcely heard of became the focus of national pride, a rallying point around which unity was forged. As the ships pushed farther south, their progress was followed with both anxiety and hope, each day bringing the nation closer to a confrontation that would test its courage and resolve. This dispatch of the task force was not only a matter of reclaiming land but also a fight for credibility, both domestically and internationally. In the Cold War context, where Britain was a key ally within NATO, failure to respond decisively would have reverberated far beyond the South Atlantic. Allies looked to see whether Britain would stand firm, while adversaries calculated whether its decline had reached the point of irrelevance. Thatcher and her government understood that this was a pivotal test, not just of military might, but of political will. The decision to go to war was therefore more than reactionary. It was an assertion of Britain's enduring place on the global stage, a refusal to let history consign it to the margins. As the naval task force pressed onward, the world watched a drama unfold that was as much about ideals as it was about geography. The story of the Falklands War would not only be written in terms of battles fought and lives lost, but also in the symbolism of a nation willing to reach across oceans to defend its people and its pride. This was the last colonial war Britain would fight, A clash that bridged the past age of empire with the realities of a changing world order. And it all began with that resolute decision in April 1982, when against all odds, Britain dispatched its fleet into the vastness of the South Atlantic, embarking on a journey that would shape its identity for generations to come. By late, British forces recaptured Goose Green, a victory that carried both strategic and symbolic weight. But the true test of the campaign was still ahead. The eyes of the world, and certainly those of both Britain and Argentina, were fixed on Port Stanley, the modest yet crucial capital of the Falkland Islands, where the final outcome of the conflict would be decided. Goose Green had shown that British troops were determined, resilient, and capable of advancing through difficult terrain under constant threat. But the scale of the coming challenge dwarfed everything that had come before. Port Stanley was not just a cluster of houses and government buildings. It was the administrative heart of the islands, the location where Argentina had planted its authority after the invasion, and the stronghold where its forces had concentrated their defenses. Every soldier on both sides knew that whoever controlled Stanley controlled the Falklands, and that the struggle for the capital would define the war itself. The journey to Port Stanley was neither straightforward nor easy. British forces, having landed at San Carlos, had to make their way across rugged terrain, often under harsh weather conditions that tested both physical stamina and morale. The winds were relentless, the nights bitterly cold, and the ground was boggy, slowing every advance. Yet in spite of these hardships, the troops pressed forward with a sense of purpose that was strengthened by the knowledge that the entire operation depended on them. They carried heavy packs, weapons, and supplies over mountains and across rivers, covering distances that would have been demanding even without the looming presence of the enemy. Every step closer to Stanley brought them into sharper confrontation with Argentine defenses, and every movement had to be calculated with precision. Meanwhile, in Port Stanley, Argentine commanders had prepared their positions with the expectation of a final stand. Trenches had been dug, artillery positioned, and soldiers entrenched in defensive lines overlooking the approaches to the capital. They knew the British advance was inevitable, and they braced themselves for the clash that would determine not just the fate of the islands, but the credibility of their government back home. Morale was mixed. Some soldiers were young conscripts, poorly equipped and enduring the same cold that afflicted their enemies, while others were hardened professionals determined to hold their ground. The Argentine leadership understood that holding Stanley would at least give them leverage in future negotiations, but losing it would make any hope of retaining the islands vanish. For the British, strategy became as important as courage. Goose Green had proven the dangers of frontal assaults against entrenched forces, and commanders recognized that Stanley's defenses could not be taken by sheer force alone. Instead, they planned a series of coordinated attacks on the surrounding high ground, the ridges and hills that overlooked the capital. Places like Mount Longdon, Two Sisters, and Tumbledown were more than just geographical features. They were the keys to unlocking Stanley itself. Securing them meant breaking through Argentina's shield and opening a path to the heart of the settlement. Soldiers knew these battles would be grueling, fought at close quarters, often at night, and under the cover of artillery fire that echoed across the desolate landscape. As the campaign unfolded, stories emerged of extraordinary bravery and endurance. Units advanced through mud and darkness, often engaging in hand-to-hand combat as they stormed enemy positions. Casualties were heavy, and every gain was hard-won. But gradually, British forces tightened their grip on the ring around Stanley. Each captured hill not only gave them a tactical advantage, but also dealt a psychological blow to the defenders, who found themselves increasingly surrounded and pressured. The determination of the troops was fueled by the awareness that the entire operation was watched anxiously back in Britain. where public opinion had been transformed by early victories and now demanded a successful conclusion. The Argentine defenders, though under immense strain, fought with tenacity. They launched counterattacks, held ground stubbornly, and resisted the British advance for as long as they could. Yet the strain of battle, combined with shortages of supplies and the relentless pressure of the enemy, began to erode their ability to continue. The weather, which had been a torment to both sides, also took its toll on the young conscripts who lacked adequate training and equipment for such conditions. By the time British troops had secured the surrounding high ground, the fate of Stanley was sealed. The defenders could see the enemy's positions dominating their lines, artillery fire closing in, and the inevitability of encirclement. When the final push towards Stanley came, it was the culmination of weeks of hardship, strategy, and sacrifice. British units advanced steadily, careful not to squander lives unnecessarily, but relentless in their objective. The Argentine forces, realizing that their position was untenable, began to falter, and within days the capital was within reach. The psychological weight of seeing the Union Jack poised to return over the town was immense, and commanders knew the end was near. On June 14th, the Argentine garrison in Port Stanley surrendered. The war, which had begun with a sudden invasion, ended with the quiet act of laying down arms in the capital. For the British, it was the vindication of their resolve and a reaffirmation of their global reach, even in what many had thought would be an era of retreat from distant commitments. For the Argentines, it was a bitter defeat that reverberated politically at home, ultimately contributing to the downfall of the ruling junta. The recapture of Port Stanley was not simply a military victory, but a moment that resonated deeply in the history of both nations. It demonstrated that despite the immense logistical challenges, Britain had succeeded in projecting its power across thousands of miles to reclaim a territory that many considered too remote to defend. The memory of Goose Green remained significant, but it was the battles around Stanley and the final surrender that truly defined the Falklands conflict. From the windswept hills to the streets of the capital, the story of the campaign was one of endurance, sacrifice, and the decisive struggle for a place whose name became forever etched into the collective memory of those who fought for it. Under the dark cloak of night, when the winds of the South Atlantic cut across the barren landscape of the Falklands, Argentine special forces made their move, slipping silently toward British positions in hopes of catching them unprepared. For them, the night offered both cover and danger, as every shadow might conceal not only safety but also the watchful eyes of their enemies. They knew that the British had advanced steadily after the hard-fought victory at Goose Green, and were tightening their grip on the approaches to Port Stanley, the capital that held the key to the entire campaign. If the Argentines could land a decisive blow, they might stall the momentum, weaken British morale, and alter the balance of the conflict. But fate that night would pit them against an adversary who was equally skilled, equally determined, and already waiting for them: the elite Special Air Service, entrenched and prepared for the possibility of a surprise assault. The clash began not with grand explosions or the roar of heavy artillery, but with the sudden crack of small arms fire in the darkness. Argentine commandos, moving with the discipline of professionals, found themselves in a deadly ambush when the SARS opened fire from concealed positions. What was meant to be a swift strike turned instantly into a desperate firefight under the pale moonlight. The British, hardened by years of training for unconventional warfare, understood how to use the terrain to their advantage. They had dug in, set overlapping fields of fire, and were ready to strike at the first sign of movement. The Argentines, no less courageous, did not retreat immediately. Instead, they fought fiercely, unleashing bursts of fire and maneuvering through the rocky ground. determined not to give up the element of surprise they had risked everything to achieve. For both, this was not simply a battle of weapons but a test of nerve, of endurance, and of willpower. The SARS, though heavily outnumbered in the initial contact, relied on their discipline and coordination. Their communications were precise, their movements synchronized, and each man understood the importance of holding the line through the long night. The Argentines, meanwhile, fought with the desperation of soldiers who knew that Port Stanley, and perhaps the outcome of the war, depended on their ability to shake the confidence of the advancing British. They launched repeated attempts to break through, each time pressing harder against the British defences, but each time encountering fierce resistance. The night sky was lit intermittently by tracer fire, the flashes of rifles and machine guns painting fleeting images of chaos across the battlefield. The air was filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder, and the cries of commands in English and Spanish echoed against the cold rocks. Both sides were locked in a brutal contest that stretched for hours, neither able to deliver the final blow that would tip the balance. Yet as the hours dragged on, the discipline and preparation of the SARS began to show. Their defensive positions, carefully chosen, gave them cover and angles of fire that the Argentines struggled to overcome. Each failed push drained the attackers further, sapping their strength and morale, while the British, though exhausted, held firm with the knowledge that reinforcements were never far behind. What made this confrontation so gripping was not only the clash of two elite forces, but the symbolic weight it carried. The Argentines had hoped their raid would be a statement, a blow against one of the most respected units of the British military, a reminder that they could still strike back effectively even as the war tilted against them. For the British, repelling the raid was about more than survival. It was about demonstrating that their advance toward Port Stanley was unstoppable, that no ambush or night raid could shake their resolve. The duel between the special forces became a microcosm of the larger war. Two nations, both thousands of miles from their mainland, fighting over wind-swept islands where every ridge and gully seemed to demand blood before it could be crossed. As dawn approached, the outcome grew clear. The SARS, though battered, remained in control of the field. The Argentines, recognizing that they could not dislodge their opponents and that further fighting would only cost them more lives without gain, began to withdraw. Their retreat was not chaotic but measured, a reflection of their professionalism even in defeat. They had fought bravely, but bravery alone could not overcome the British preparation and resolve. The raid that had begun with hope of turning the tide ended instead as a grim reminder of the growing imbalance in the campaign. For the British, the night raid and its failure for the Argentines reinforced a vital truth. The path to Port Stanley was still fraught with danger, but each engagement that they survived, each attempt they repelled, brought them one step closer to their objective. Soldiers who had endured the tense hours of fighting that night carried forward not just scars of battle, but also a hardened sense of determination. They had faced the very best of the Argentine forces and had held the line. And with that knowledge, they prepared for the greater battles still to come. And so, as the sun rose over the desolate landscape, casting its first light on the smoke and silence that lingered where chaos had reigned only hours before, the war pressed forward. The night raid became another chapter in the story of the Falklands, a story of endurance and sacrifice, of bold gambits and fierce resistance, where even the quiet hours of darkness offered no respite from the unforgiving demands of war. It was proof that victory would not come cheaply, and that every step toward Port Stanley would have to be paid for in courage, discipline, and unrelenting will. The journey of the British paratroopers and Marines across the Falkland Islands was not defined merely by their encounters with enemy forces, but by the relentless grip of the environment itself. which at times seemed as determined to break them as the Argentine defenders. The islands presented a landscape that could strip even the most hardened soldier of his strength. Vast expanses of sodden peat bogs stretched endlessly, swallowing boots with every step, while jagged ridges and mountains loomed, forcing men burdened with heavy packs to climb through mist and biting wind. Progress was painfully slow, each mile won through sheer persistence rather than tactical brilliance. And yet these long marches became the crucible in which their resilience was tested and forged. The weather was perhaps the most unrelenting adversary. Rain lashed against their faces, often turning to icy sleet or snow without warning, and the wind howled across the barren hills, cutting into exposed skin like a blade. The soldiers' uniforms, designed for combat but not for the unforgiving extremes of the South Atlantic, became drenched and heavy, offering little warmth. Nights brought no relief, for they slept in makeshift shelters or shallow depressions in the ground, huddled together against the cold, their bodies shivering uncontrollably. The lack of proper rest meant that fatigue seeped into every action. Eyes stung from lack of sleep, legs trembled from overuse, yet the column kept moving forward because retreat was never an option. Supplies, too, were scarce, and this scarcity nodded moral. Rations often fell short, forcing men to stretch what little food they had, sharing between them or cutting meals down to the bare minimum. Hunger sharpened the edges of exhaustion, and thirst became a constant companion when fresh water sources proved difficult to find. Every soldier carried what he could, but the heavy packs often weighed upwards of 100 pounds, filled with ammunition, weapons, and gear essential for survival. The loads pulled at shoulders, bit into backs, and made every incline feel like an impossible mountain. Yet abandoning them was unthinkable, for their very survival depended on what those packs contained. Despite these conditions, the spirit of the men did not collapse. If anything, adversity bound them tighter together. There were moments when laughter rose unexpectedly in the ranks, sparked by a joke or an absurd observation about their misery. And such moments became lifelines that reminded them of humanity in the bleak landscape. Songs, sometimes off-key and half forgotten, echoed into the night as a way to keep spirits alive. Camaraderie became their shield against despair, each man drawing strength from the determination of those beside him. Leadership also played its part, as officers shared in the hardships, trudging through the same mud, carrying the same burdens, and showing by example that endurance was possible even when the body screamed for relief. The marches themselves were more than mere movements from one point to another. They were acts of will that carried strategic importance. The British had to traverse these hostile miles to reach key objectives, and every day spent in the bogs and mountains was a step closer to regaining control of the islands. The Argentine defenders, well aware of the terrain's challenges, had hoped it would delay or weaken their adversary, but the steady progress of the paratroopers and Marines proved that determination could outweigh geography. The knowledge that the enemy awaited ahead did not break their stride. Rather, it hardened their resolve, for each man understood that the sacrifices endured along the way would only have meaning if they reached their destination ready to fight. As days turned into weeks, the marches left their mark on the men. Feet blistered and swollen from constant wetness, muscles ached without respite, and some stumbled under the strain, only to be lifted by comrades who refused to leave anyone behind. The image of columns moving across bleak hillsides, silhouetted against glaciers, became symbolic of the campaign itself, grinding, unforgiving, but unstoppable. The soldiers did not stride with the fresh confidence of parade grounds. They trudged with the wary determination of men who knew the cost of failure and were willing to pay the price of endurance. There were moments of stillness amid the hardship. At dawn, when the mist clung low over the valleys, the men sometimes paused to take in the stark beauty of the landscape. It was a beauty born of desolation, the kind that whispered of isolation and survival. And though it offered no comfort, it reminded them of the unique battle they were fighting, not only against a human enemy but against nature itself. At night, when stars pierced through gaps in the clouds, men lay on their backs despite the cold and mud, staring upward and thinking of home. Those brief moments of reflection gave meaning to their suffering, for they carried with them the hope of returning, of seeing familiar faces again, and that hope gave strength where supplies and warmth could not. Each step across the bogs and mountains became part of a larger story of endurance. It was not glory that carried the men forward, nor promises of recognition, but a stubborn refusal to yield. The march was a silent declaration that no hardship could turn them aside, no exhaustion could make them falter, and no deprivation could break the unity that bound them. When they finally reached their positions, ready to engage in the battles that would decide the fate of the Falklands, they did so not as men broken by the journey, but as soldiers who had endured one of the harshest marches imaginable, hardened by every mile of mud, every blast of wind, and every sleepless night. The hardships had not defeated them. They had transformed them into a force as unyielding as the ground they had crossed. The sinking of the Sir Galahad would come to symbolize the cruel cost of the Falklands conflict, a moment etched into the collective memory of both soldiers and civilians who followed the war from afar. And it was one of those incidents that revealed the fragility of even the most carefully planned military operations. The ship, a Royal Fleet auxiliary vessel carrying troops of the Welsh Guards, was anchored in Bluff Cove on June 8, 1982, when Argentine aircraft struck with a ferocity that transformed what had been a logistical operation into the single deadliest blow the British endured during the war. In the chaos that followed, 46 men were killed outright and more than 150 were badly wounded, many with burns and injuries so severe that their lives would never be the same again. It was a shattering loss that rippled across the task force and back home to Britain, where the news brought shock and grief to families who had been anxiously following the progress of the campaign. To understand the impact of this tragedy, one must place it within the broader narrative of the British advance across the islands. The campaign had already demanded extraordinary endurance from paratroopers and Marines who trekked through unforgiving terrain, often with little sleep, sparse rations, and the constant bite of cold rain and winds. Their journey across peat bogs and rugged mountains had tested their bodies and their morale, but they pressed forward, believing that each march brought them closer to retaking the settlements and ridges that stood between them and final victory. Against this backdrop of relentless physical and emotional strain, the sudden devastation of the Sir Galahad was more than just another loss. It was a grim reminder of the precarious balance between progress and disaster. The attack itself unfolded with frightening speed. Argentine pilots, flying low and fast, spotted the vessel vulnerable and stationary, its decks laden with troops and equipment awaiting disembarkation. Precision and desperation combined in their assault as bombs tore through the ship, igniting a fireball that consumed compartments and trapped men below deck. Survivors recalled scenes of panic and bravery intermingled. Some soldiers struggled to save comrades who were engulfed in flames, while others leapt into the freezing water to escape the inferno, their skin blistered and lungs choked by smoke. Naval crews worked frantically to fight the blaze, but the vessel soon became a burning hulk, its destruction complete. For the British command, the loss of the Sir Galahad was not only a human catastrophe, but also a logistical setback that threatened to disrupt the momentum of their advance. The Welsh Guards, who had been intended to play a crucial role in upcoming operations, were decimated before they could even reach the front lines. This forced commanders to reorganize their units under enormous pressure, while also grappling with the psychological blow delivered by the attack. Morale, already stretched thin by fatigue and hardship, took a severe hit as soldiers who had endured weeks of grueling marches now faced the reality that even when they were not engaged in battle, they were still vulnerable to sudden and devastating strikes from above. The sinking also reverberated in Britain, where the media quickly captured images of the burning ship and the wounded men who were evacuated to medical facilities. These pictures, broadcast into homes across the nation, stripped away any illusions that the war was a clean or distant affair. Mothers, fathers, and loved ones who had been clinging to the hope of a swift and relatively bloodless campaign were confronted with the harsh reality of sacrifice, and the names of the dead joined a growing list of casualties that made clear the war's human toll. The government, led by Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, found itself navigating the delicate task of sustaining public support for the campaign while acknowledging the scale of the tragedy. Yet, amidst the sorrow, the resilience of the troops emerged as a defining characteristic of the campaigner's spirit. Survivors of the Sir Galahad, many grievously wounded, showed extraordinary courage in their recovery, and those who remained on the front lines channeled their grief into determination. Accounts from the period reveal that soldiers vowed not to let their comrades' deaths be in vain, pressing forward with renewed resolve to complete the mission. This determination was vital in the days that followed, as British forces launched the final series of assaults that would culminate in the recapture of Port Stanley and the end of hostilities. The Sir Galahad tragedy thus stands as both a nadir and a turning point in the Falklands conflict. It exposed the vulnerability of even the most disciplined forces to sudden catastrophe, underscored the human cost of war, and reminded commanders of the ever-present dangers posed by an enemy determined to resist until the very end. At the same time, it tested the mettle of the British forces in a way that would ultimately highlight their endurance and capacity to adapt under pressure. Looking back, the burning of the Sir Galahad remains one of the most haunting images of the war, a stark testament to the unpredictability and cruelty of armed conflict. It is remembered not only for the lives lost and the suffering endured, but also for the way it encapsulated the broader story of the Falklands campaign, moments of triumph intertwined with moments of heartbreak, endurance forged in hardship, and victory purchased at a cost that would never be forgotten. The men who perished aboard the ship, and those who survived with scars both visible and unseen, became part of a legacy that ensured the memory of the conflict would carry with it both pride in achievement and sorrow for sacrifice. In this way, the sinking of the Sir Galahad remains inseparable from the larger tale of endurance, courage, and loss that defined the Falklands War. When the Argentine air raids that had struck Sir Galahad and inflicted the worst single-day losses for the British began to fade into memory, the war in the Falklands entered a darker and even more demanding phase, one that shifted from the unpredictable fury of the skies to the grinding, exhausting, and brutal combat among the frozen rocks and windswept ridges that guarded the approaches to Port Stanley. For the British commanders, it had become clear that the only way to break through and bring the campaign to its conclusion was to seize the mountain strongholds that the Argentines had turned into fortified bastions, natural citadels where every boulder and trench had been prepared to resist. Mount Longdon, Two Sisters, and Mount Harriet stood as the sentinels before Stanley, and taking them would demand night fighting at close quarters, under conditions that tested not only skill and courage but endurance, resolve, and the ability to keep moving forward in the face of heavy loss. The assault on Mount Longdon began under the cover of darkness, with paratroopers advancing silently across minefields and rocky gullies, the dim glow of distant fires and flares flickering against the horizon. The Argentines had dug in deeply, machine guns and mortars covering every approach, and they were determined to hold. The British soldiers crept forward with bayonets fixed, rifles ready, nerves taut, knowing that discovery meant devastation. The opening moments of the battle were a chaos of sudden explosions, mines detonating beneath boots, machine gun fire erupting from hidden nests, and the air split by cries of wounded men. What followed was hours of bitter close combat, paratroopers clambering over rocks to outflank enemy positions, sometimes engaging at distances so short that grenades were thrown by hand from trench to trench. The night sky over Longdon pulsed with bursts of light. Tracers arsing, artillery shells hammering the ridge, and yet for every yard gained the cost was immense. Men who had marched for days, carrying the weight of their kit through sleet and freezing wind, now had to summon strength from somewhere deeper to keep pushing forward. When dawn finally came, the ridge was scarred and littered with the signs of battle, and though Longdon had been taken, the price in blood was heavy on both sides. To the south, the Royal Marines moved against Two Sisters, another formidable height that the Argentines had defended with determination. The attack there unfolded in much the same way, with the British advancing at night, hoping to use the shadows to mask their movements. Yet the moment the first shots rang out, the mountainside came alive with fire. Mortars whistled overhead, machine guns swept the approaches, and the Argentines fought tenaciously, refusing to yield ground without a struggle. The fighting stretched into the night, hand to hand in places, as men hurled grenades, scrambled across jagged rocks, and pressed forward despite exhaustion. The sheer ferocity of the encounter underscored the fact that these mountains were not merely geographic obstacles but deeply symbolic positions that the defenders clung to as their last line before the heart of Stanley. For the attackers, there was no turning back, for behind them lay the long march from the landing beaches and the memory of the ships struck at sea. The momentum had to be carried forward, and so with every surge the British Marines pressed harder, until the Argentine defenders, battered and running low on supplies, were finally forced to abandon their positions. Meanwhile, Mount Harriet presented yet another daunting challenge, a rocky mass bristling with trenches and fortified points that had to be pried loose one by one. The guards and commandos assigned to the task approached from unexpected directions, maneuvering through difficult terrain to catch the defenders off balance. Even so, the assault quickly became a grueling contest, with artillery pounding the slopes and small units advancing in sudden bursts, trying to overwhelm the strongpoints that raked the approaches with fire. What marked the battle for Harriet was the sheer persistence required, for the defenders had anticipated a frontal attack and prepared their defenses accordingly. By pressing from the flanks and keeping constant pressure, the British eventually managed to break through, capturing positions piece by piece until the ridge was finally theirs. Yet once again, the cost was steep, with casualties mounting as men pushed themselves far beyond their limits. Taken together, these battles represented not just tactical victories, but decisive moments in the campaign. The capture of Longdon, Two Sisters, and Harriet secured the high ground that overlooked Stanley, stripping the Argentines of their defensive shield and exposing the town to the advancing British forces. The psychological impact was just as significant as the strategic, for the men who had endured those nights emerged exhausted yet resolute, hardened by the knowledge that they had faced the worst the enemy could throw at them and still prevailed. For the Argentines, the loss of the mountain positions marked the beginning of the end, their defensive line crumbling as their troops, many wary conscripts far from home, saw that the high ridges they had been told were impregnable could in fact be taken. The stories that came from those nights speak not only of tactics and maneuvers, but of human resilience and sacrifice. Soldiers carrying their wounded comrades across minefields under fire, officers rallying their men to make one more push when it seemed impossible, and the quiet acts of courage that never made it into reports yet defined the spirit of those who fought. The terrain itself seemed to conspire against both sides, with freezing winds, rocky escarpments, and the constant threat of mines and artillery making every step a gamble. And yet, By enduring, by refusing to yield, the British forces secured the way forward, a terrible cost but with undeniable determination. As dawn broke over the captured mountains, the campaign stood at a turning point. The high ground was in British hands. The road to Stanley lay open, and though more battles remained, the tide had shifted irreversibly. The memory of the men lost on those ridges would linger, a reminder that victory had been bought dearly, but also that the will to endure, even in the darkest night, had carried them through. In the shadow of Longdon, two sisters. And Harriet. The end of the Falklands War was drawing closer, not because of overwhelming numbers or technology, but because of the relentless drive of men who refused to stop until the heights were theirs. The struggle for the Falklands had already taken on the character of a grinding campaign, with both sides enduring weeks of hardship in a landscape that offered little mercy. The British forces, advancing steadily despite the freezing winds and treacherous terrain, had already fought their way through bloody contests at Mount Longdon, Two Sisters, and Mount Harriet. Those victories had given them control of vital high ground overlooking the Argentine defenses. But the final push toward the island's capital still loomed ahead. The men knew that the next battles would be decisive, for Port Stanley lay just beyond the looming hills of Mount Tumbledown and Wireless Ridge, bastions that the Argentine forces were determined to hold at any cost. These positions were more than geographical features. They were the last protective wall between the advancing British troops and the settlement that symbolized the heart of the campaign. As the British commanders studied their maps, the importance of Tumbledown was immediately clear. Rising above the approaches to Stanley, it offered commanding views and artillery vantage points that would make any direct advance suicidal if left in enemy hands. The Argentine defenders, many of them dug into fortified bunkers with overlapping fields of fire, had prepared for weeks to repel an assault. They knew the British would have to come for the mountain eventually, and they resolved to make them pay dearly for every inch of rock. The British, in turn, could not afford delay. The campaign had already stretched into winter, and with each passing day the weather threatened to turn against them. To secure Tumbledown and its neighboring ridges meant forcing the Argentine forces into retreat and opening the path to the capital. The attack on Mount Tumbledown began under cover of darkness, with British units advancing quietly through the cold night. The terrain was as much an enemy as the defenders' jagged rocks tore at boots. Icy winter cross exposed ridges, and every step carried the risk of stumbling into prepared positions. Yet the troops pressed forward, supported by the thunder of artillery that crashed against the mountain like rolling waves. Each bombardment lit the sky, revealing fleeting silhouettes of soldiers moving across the ground, and each explosion shook the rock beneath them. The Argentine defenders returned fire with determination, their heavy weapons raking the slopes with bursts of tracer fire that cut glowing arcs through the night. The battle quickly devolved into close-quarters fighting, with British units clawing their way uphill against entrenched opposition. What made the assault bearable, and ultimately successful, was the sheer weight of British firepower and coordination. Artillery units, positioned carefully behind the lines, unleashed a relentless barrage that kept the defenders pinned while infantry units edged forward. Armored support, though limited in such rugged terrain, played a crucial role whenever possible, its guns adding to the constant pressure. The Argentines fought fiercely, refusing to yield despite mounting casualties. But the imbalance in sustained firepower was telling. The longer the battle stretched, the more their lines frayed under the strain of continuous bombardment. Every British advance was purchased with blood. Yet slowly, methodically, they gained the upper slopes, pushing the defenders back step by step. As dawn began to break, the exhaustion of the fight was etched into the faces of every man. Smoke drifted across the ridges, mingling with the pale light of morning, and the mountains seemed scarred and blackened by the ferocity of the struggle. Yet victory was within reach. The defenders, having held through a night of unrelenting assault, finally began to give way. British units surged forward, overwhelming the last pockets of resistance with bayonet charges and determined fire. Mount Tumbledown, once thought impregnable, fell into their hands after one of the most brutal clashes of the campaign. For the men who stood upon its summit, there was no elation, only relief and the quiet acknowledgement of comrades lost in the struggle. No sooner had Tumbledown been secured than attention turned to Wireless Ridge, another defensive position standing between the British and Port Stanley. Though not as imposing in height, the ridge was heavily fortified and formed a natural barrier across the approach routes. Argentine forces there were still intact and prepared to resist, but their morale had begun to waver after the fall of Tumbledown. The British, sensing the momentum, prepared to strike again before the defenders could recover. Once more, artillery opened the way, its shells crashing into the ridge with a fury that shook the ground for miles around. This time, the coordination between artillery and infantry reached its peak. Waves of fire rolled across the ridge, suppressing Argentine strongpoints before infantry units advanced in well-timed maneuvers. The defenders fought back with determination. But their lines were thinner, their supplies stretched, and their confidence shaken. Under overwhelming pressure, they began to yield ground. British units exploited every weakness, pressing forward relentlessly, until Wireless Ridge, too, was in their grasp. The fall of the ridge effectively shattered the last coherent line of Argentine resistance around Stanley. The cumulative effect of these victories was decisive. With both Tumbledown and Wireless Ridge lost, the Argentine commanders recognized that further defense of the capital was untenable. Their troops were exhausted, supplies dwindling, and the British advance now threatened to encircle them. The once formidable defensive ring had been broken by sustained assaults supported by overwhelming artillery and armor, and the will to continue the fight evaporated in the face of inevitable defeat. For the British troops, the capture of these key positions marked the climax of their arduous campaign. The road to Stanley now lay open, and with it the end of a bitter conflict fought across unforgiving terrain. Yet the cost was undeniable. Heavy casualties had been suffered on both sides, and the scars of those nights on Tumbledown and Wireless Ridge would linger long after the war was over. Still, in strategic terms, these battles represented the turning of the tide, the final unraveling of Argentine resistance, and the moment when the campaign's outcome could no longer be in doubt. In the days that followed, as the Argentine surrender was formalized, those who had fought at Tumbledown and Wireless Ridge reflected not only on their victory, but on the extraordinary effort that had brought it about. It was not a triumph of brute force alone, but of endurance, coordination, and the grim determination to see the fight through despite every hardship. The battles had tested every man to his limit, yet in breaking the Argentine resistance, they had also broken the back of the war itself. The battles for Mount Tumbledown and Wireless Ridge had left the Argentine defenses shattered, their soldiers exhausted, and their lines of communication collapsing under the weight of relentless British pressure. Days of fierce combat, fought in brutal conditions against highly trained and determined adversaries, had drained the Argentine forces both physically and psychologically. Each ridge and hilltop had been defended with courage, yet the overwhelming combination of British artillery, armor, and infantry coordination had slowly but decisively stripped away their ability to resist. By the time the British units pressed forward into the outskirts of Port Stanley, it was evident to those on the ground that the campaign was nearing its inevitable conclusion. General Mario Benjamin Menendez, the Argentine commander in the Falklands, carried the crushing burden of responsibility for thousands of young conscripts and professional soldiers under his command. He had watched his defensive lines crumble one by one, despite repeated attempts to reorganize and hold firm. Reports from his officers painted a dire picture. Ammunition supplies running dangerously low, artillery batteries silenced either by British counter-fire or lack of shells, and soldiers who had been pushed to the limit of human endurance after weeks of exposure to the cold, wet, and punishing terrain. These were not failures of individual bravery, but the harsh reality of facing a better equipped and more cohesive enemy that held the initiative. Inside Port Stanley, morale among Argentine troops had sunk to its lowest point. Many were young men barely out of adolescence, drafted into service with little preparation for the horrors of modern combat. While their courage was undeniable, they faced the psychological shock of constant bombardment from land and sea, combined with the knowledge that British forces were closing in with relentless precision. Food was scarce, medical supplies were stretched, and communications with Buenos Aires grew increasingly strained. In the city itself, civilians and soldiers alike began to feel the inevitability of defeat looming closer with each passing hour. Meanwhile, the British commanders recognized that the end was in sight. Having secured the key heights surrounding Port Stanley, they prepared to move forward, but with a cautious awareness of the human cost that further fighting could bring. Their artillery units, which had proven decisive in breaking Argentine resistance on the ridges, were ready to pound any last-ditch defenses. Yet the mood among British troops was not one of reckless triumphalism, but of grim determination to finish what had been started. They, too, were weary after weeks of brutal campaigning in the harshest of environments. But they knew that one final push would bring the conflict to its conclusion. General Mendez understood his position with clarity, even as he faced immense political pressure from Buenos Aires to continue fighting at all costs. From the capital, military leaders demanded defiance, urging him to resist, to bleed the British further, and to uphold national honor. But Menendez had to weigh these demands against the reality on the ground. A force that was crumbling, a population at risk, and soldiers who could no longer sustain the burden of battle. The decision he faced was not just a military one but a profoundly moral one, balancing duty to his nation against his responsibility to preserve the lives of those entrusted to his command. In his final deliberations, Mendez listened to his exhausted officers, who reported that their troops were at breaking point. Some units were scattered and disorganized, others still holding positions with remarkable resilience. But almost all were cut off from meaningful supply or reinforcement. The British had gained total control of the battlefield as momentum, and any further resistance would lead only to unnecessary suffering and loss of life. The inevitability of surrender weighed heavily on him, yet he knew that prolonging the fight could mean destruction for Port Stanley itself, along with the needless deaths of both soldiers and civilians. Thus, with a heavy heart, General Mendez admitted the truth. His troops could no longer continue. This was not an act of cowardice, nor a betrayal of those who had fought so valiantly, but rather a recognition of reality. He saw in the faces of his men the exhaustion of weeks of struggle, and he knew that they had given all that could be asked of them. By choosing capitulation, he hoped at least to prevent further bloodshed, to safeguard what remained of his force, and to allow his soldiers to live on rather than perish in a hopeless last stand. When word of his decision spread, reactions were mixed. In Buenos Aires, anger and disappointment surged, with officials decrying what they saw as premature capitulation. They had demanded defiance to the bitter end, imagining that prolonged resistance might strengthen Argentina's bargaining position or at least serve as a symbol of unyielding resolve. But those far from the battlefield could not fully grasp the desperation of the situation, the sheer impossibility of sustaining a fight that had already been lost. On the ground in Port Stanley, however, many soldiers felt a wave of relief, mingled with sorrow. They had endured the cold, the hunger, the fear, and the relentless enemy fire, And now they were being told they could finally lay down their arms. For the British, Menendez's surrender was the culmination of a campaign fought at great cost. But it was also a moment marked by restraint. When Argentine forces laid down their weapons, British officers ensured that the terms of capitulation were honored with dignity, avoiding unnecessary humiliation. For both, it was a solemn moment, one that closed a chapter of conflict, even as it opened another in the political struggle that would follow. The surrender did not erase the bravery shown by Argentine soldiers, nor did it diminish the determination of British troops who had fought through some of the most challenging conditions imaginable. Rather, it underscored the tragic reality of war, that beyond strategy and politics, it is fought by individuals whose lives hang in the balance of decisions made by those in command. General Menendez's choice to capitulate was one such decision, born not of weakness but of a grim recognition that his men could endure no more. It brought an end to the fighting on the Falklands, sparing countless lives from further loss, and ensuring that the struggle would henceforth be carried out not with rifles and artillery, but with words and diplomacy. In this way, the fall of Port Stanley was not just a military conclusion but a human one, a turning point shaped by the limits of endurance and the weight of responsibility. General Menendez's decision to capitulate, though controversial, remains one of the defining moments of the conflict, symbolizing both the futility of continued resistance and the courage it takes to admit when a fight is no longer possible. As the guns finally fell silent over the windswept Falklands in June 1982, the world was left to reflect on a conflict that had erupted suddenly and ended with consequences far greater than the island's size might suggest. Britain had regained control of the Falklands, restoring sovereignty and reaffirming its determination to defend its territories. But the price of victory was written in the sacrifice of young men who never returned home, in the grief of families who carried loss forever, and in the scars left on those who had faced the brutal realities of combat. For Argentina, the surrender of General Menendez was not merely a military defeat. It exposed the fragility of the ruling junta, weakened its grip on power, and hastened the political changes that were soon to transform the nation. For Britain, the victory was more than a military success. It was a defining moment for Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, whose leadership had been under fire before the conflict. The swift and decisive military response galvanized her authority, reshaped her political future, and earned her the reputation of the Iron Lady on the world stage. Yet beyond the political ramifications, the war left behind sobering reminders of the human cost. Over 600 Argentine and more than 250 British servicemen lost their lives in a war fought thousands of miles away from both homelands, and their stories of bravery, endurance, and sacrifice remain at the heart of what we remember today. The Falklands War underscored the fact that modern warfare, even when limited in scope, carries a devastating toll. Ships once thought untouchable were sunk in fiery battles at sea. Aircraft clashed in the cold skies over the South Atlantic, and soldiers endured bitter conditions on rugged terrain. The technology of the late 20th century had evolved to make war faster and deadlier, but it could not lessen the pain of those caught in its path. Families in both Britain and Argentina listened anxiously to radio updates, scanned newspapers for names, and prayed for loved ones fighting far away. When the war ended, it was not with the euphoria of triumph alone, but with the heavy silence of mourning that followed every battle. Yet from tragedy came lessons. The conflict highlighted the importance of readiness, logistics, and the resilience of armed forces operating in some of the harshest environments on Earth. It also emphasized the weight of leadership in times of crisis. Thatcher's resolve to act swiftly not only altered the trajectory of her government, but also redefined Britain's place in the late Cold War order. At the same time, Argentina's defeat accelerated a process of reckoning, forcing its people to confront the failings of the dictatorship and ultimately paving the way for a return to democracy. In this sense, the war became more than a clash over distant islands. It became a turning point in the political destinies of both nations. Looking back now, decades later, the Falklands War serves as a reminder of how quickly history can change course. What began as a surprise invasion meant to distract from domestic struggles turned into a test of willpower and endurance, a trial by fire that left no side untouched. The winds that sweep across the Falklands still carry echoes of that brief but fierce conflict, reminding us of the courage and the costs, the victories and the losses, and the fragile balance between ambition and consequence that defines human history. As we close this story, I want to thank you for joining me on this journey into the past. History is not only about dates and battles, it is about people, decisions, and the ripple effects that continue long after the last shots are fired. If you enjoyed this exploration and would like to travel further with us through the moments that shaped our world, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with others who may also be curious about the untold sides of history. Your support helps us bring more stories to life, more voices from the past into the present, and more lessons for the future. And now, as the night falls and we let these memories rest, I wish you peace, reflection, and a good night's sleep. May the lessons of history remind us not only of what was lost but also of what can be learned. And may tomorrow bring us closer to understanding and to one another. Good night, and until next time,